let's dive in. Where should we start?
So I pulled together a presentation and some of the bullet points around it. Do you want me to start there and just kind of level set together, or did you already review that?
So I've looked through it, but it's been a little while, and particularly since we're going to record this, might as well do a quick level set.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, what we'll talk about in this presentation is the brokered FHIR versus networked FHIR concepts. I'll first define them and just talk about what the value of each is and why we are looking at this from our perspective as eHealth Exchange. So from a definition perspective, brokered FHIR is this concept that is sort of the future of FHIR traffic, where FHIR transactions are executed on a point-to-point basis, but FHIR discovery, endpoint discovery, and patient discovery is done through a QHIN or a network. So you have this intermediary, this network intermediary that facilitates the process and then enables 2 points within the network or across networks to connect, and then the UDAP auto client registration enables those nodes within the networks to actually communicate directly.
And so just to make sure we were tying the terms together here, this concept is what the recent TEFCA QHIN Technical Framework draft calls facilitated FHIR, yes?
Yes, you're right. We did this, we pulled this together on before we had that draft, and so the definitions are a little different.
No, that's fine. Just so for folks who are seeing this term brokered FHIR, that this is synonymous with what the TEFCA calls facilitated.
Right. All right, and then networked FHIR is more about actually sending FHIR data through an intermediary. FHIR transactions are executed through the network intermediary, so the network intermediary is actually the only thing that's ever talking to a given participant on a network. So this does allow the same FHIR API calls to exist. It does, require some additional maintenance on the data as the data passes through. As you might know, FHIR has these different reference URLs in it that reference the actual FHIR repository or the server that contains the data. And so having a network intermediary means that if you're going to make another request for that data, if you want to go read that FHIR resource in the future, you need the actual URL where that resource is going to be located. And in this case, it needs to be the network intermediary's URL so it can properly forward that request on and go read that data from the server. Because you don't,
on these definitions, just to make sure I've got kind of the assumptions lined up here. Networked FHIR refers specifically to a scenario where the client knows that this sort of network is in place,
yes.
Rather than, the client might think they're talking directly to the endpoint, but of course under the hood, that endpoint could be managed by a network or another organization that kind of encapsulates those details. But network here involves, some knowledge and participation from the client in that the scheme is different.
Yep, the client would actually have to adjust their FHIR queries slightly to indicate to meet the network requirements. So when you make a FHIR API call, normally you're sending it directly into a FHIR server, but if you're sending it into the network intermediary, you need to tell the intermediary who should be responding to this. So there are some slight differences in how we approach FHIR API calls with a network, but generally it is intended to be opaque to the client after they are onboarded.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. So one of the, we'll talk more about the pros and cons. I won't dive into that right now, but looking at brokered FHIR, this process basically allows a requester to check with an intermediary to identify an endpoint and to get the information from that endpoint. In the TEFCA world, this would be that directory that enables a user to understand who is inside the network, who can they communicate with, and what URL can they access that that FHIR server. The intermediary would then provide the relevant details back to the requester after they make that request. And then the requester does that UDAP auto client registration process to obtain a client ID from the responder. And then the requester is able to make authentication and then subsequently FHIR API calls against that responder directly. So it's just a kind of a recap on that brokered concept.
Yep.
All right, from the network perspective, we have implemented this as the eHealth Exchange in production today. And the network concept allows us to communicate between 12 different health systems and the FDA. So when a patient has an adverse event, health systems can notify the FDA via FHIR, or the FDA can retrieve data via FHIR after they receive a notification through other systems. So what this allows is essentially that network process where all the traffic goes through the eHealth exchange in the middle, and the organizations that are consuming or sending FHIR data are at different points in the network.
And can you say a little bit more about the APIs that are backing this networking example? So particularly in this diagram, are some of the hospitals or health systems using their existing EHR technology, like the FHIR API they might get from an EHR like Cerner or
Yes.
Epic? Can you say more about what the EHR vendors are doing in that context to support this exchange?
Yeah, so in this example, the EHR vendors don't have to lift a finger to support this exchange. They are already providing the US CDI version 1 compliant FHIR APIs. And so the expectation is that those FHIR APIs are available and meet the US CDI v1 overall data structure. The each individual electronic health record deployment then registers the eHealth Exchange's client ID inside of it as an application, which enables the FHIR API calls to be made.
So in this context, the eHealth Exchange has a client that's acting as a backend services client to connect with those EHRs.
Correct.
And it's got sort of administrative level permissions. It can issue queries for or about kind of anyone in the population there.
It has scopes for specific APIs and is able to query any patient in the population, correct?
Got it. And so those backend services are what you use to be able to pull data into this network exchange.
Yep. So the FDA is able to query for data, and that's the use case that we have deployed, where the FDA receives a different document that indicates, hey, there's this thing happened at our health system. The FDA doesn't get all of the clinical information that they need from that document, and they then issue a query to us to get more information.
Cool. All right. Sounds good.
All right. So just talking through the pros and cons of each of these concepts, just to give us a high level idea of what value they add. So brokered FHIR, facilitated FHIR provides direct connectivity between the requester and responder. And obviously this is good from a latency perspective. So you have much more rapid data exchange and the ability to go get that data directly from the responder. You don't need that network intermediary rewriting or anything that changes the data in any way as it's flowing through, because there is no intermediary. The cons are mainly around deployment or implementation of this process. So automated client registration is not available today. Brokered FHIR requires automated client registration. And so because it's not available, this concept truly isn't available in production EHRs today. Looking at it from another perspective, maybe you can do a manual client registration and go, instead of going through that UDAP auto client registration process. That manual client registration does require, several hours of time from the health system in order to enable it and get it into production at a very minimum. And so when you think about like having a network of 100 different nodes, if I'm one node on that network, I would need 99 other networks to manually register my client ID today, which means 99 times those couple of hours, which is, quickly becomes unsustainable.
So eHealth Exchange is sort of looking at ways to make this easier, or maybe make it scale better, or kind of the practical aspects of deployment. I guess one question that I want to understand is, why not implement this? In other words, eHealth Exchange could register one backend services client, as you've done today with several health systems, but then expose exactly this interface that you have on the screen here, the brokered FHIR API, for other parties like FDA to connect to. And that way, those parties wouldn't need to care whether the client registration was being hosted by eHealth Exchange or being hosted by Epic or Cerner at a clinical site. You've got pros and cons sort of weighed as though these are competing alternatives. But if you're in the business of offering a new service, you could give that service whatever API shape you wanted to, including potentially this one.
Yeah, we have considered that, and the concept of allowing another party to use your own client as a FHIR client is it's a little different than what we're doing as a network, because we do have the ability to say yes or no to specific traffic that comes through our door before we proxy it over to a responder. So what you're suggesting is that sort of we would download implement our client on a responder system, and then a requester would be able to use that client directly to make FHIR API calls?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay.
I should say, I'm suggesting actually the same integration mechanism you have today, where you use your client to proxy calls.
Yeah.
You still have that point of control with consistent policies implemented as a proxy. But the folks who were calling you wouldn't have to know that you were the one providing the service. They might register themselves with, the University of Wisconsin, which just happens to be an endpoint that you manage and control for the university.
Sure.
And in that context, you would still have the same kinds of control in place, but clients wouldn't have to do a different thing based on the fact that you were a network versus maybe just you being a single hospital.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. That would basically allow us to act in more of a transparent manner, where the client just is actually querying a unique endpoint that is specific to that responder. Okay.
Yeah, that's roughly the question.
Yeah. I mean, that is possible. It's not the deployment that we've looked at, primarily because that's a little bit higher lift in terms of and the value that it adds, we haven't seen as a significant burden to the industry compared to what we're doing with the networked approach, them being pretty similar. But definitely great feedback. We can think about that further.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, sort of, I'm looking at the guidance that TEFCA is trying to coalesce around their QHIN Technical Framework. And it seems like where there is divergence between that and real world deployments, those should be opportunities to ask why, and see if one side could sort of align more directly with the other. I don't know which direction that means yet, so just trying to understand. The APIs we're going to look at for eHealth Exchange, it sounds like, have been developed by eHealth Exchange, but maybe aren't being offered by other QHINs. So that might be sort of an area to shine a light on and ask what are the things that could be supported uniformly.
Yeah, and we are actively working with other QHINs or engaging with them to try and figure this out together. What is the best thing for everybody involved? I think part of this presentation at the end talks about what is the difference between networked and brokered in terms of timelines and where are we heading? And I think we all agree that brokered or facilitated FHIR is the future, that it's the way that we want to see things in the future. But at this time, the question is what's the path of least resistance to actually getting FHIR connectivity working for a lot of providers? And the network concept to us is the easiest method to do that.
Cool. All right, let's keep going.
Yeah. All right. So pros and cons of networked FHIR. So essentially what we are, like I just said, what we're going to be able to do is enable a single client ID registration at each provider. So the eHealth Exchange goes in, we register our client ID with the provider, or the data source in general, because it could be any FHIR server. And then we're going to allow network intermediaries to make requests. Something to talk about with networked FHIR as well is that you can have value-added services because you have this intermediary that can actually do more than just proxy FHIR requests. So eHealth Exchange is deploying a Smart on FHIR app proxy, which actually allows apps to be onboarded into our app, and then the health systems just have to implement one app. Again, this is more about reducing the burden on the health system or the consumer of the Smart on FHIR applications, so that they can more easily and more and smoothly onboard new technologies to meet their needs. But there's also concepts out there like data bundling, or transforming data in certain ways to enrich that information, or to make it more appetizing for a given consumer, that a network provides, right? You have this concept of being able to add value into that transaction in a number of different ways.
Yeah, so these make sense to me. I would characterize a lot of these as benefits of an API gateway technology kind of in general. And whether you say using an API gateway is the same as exposing a networked endpoint, I think there we have some gray area. In other words, I could imagine functionality just like this that was incorporated into a certified EHR product or an independent module that a health system just deployed out of the box. And the technology capabilities look really very similar. It's just a question of kind of who is pulling the trigger and who's responsible for the various pieces of the data pipeline.
I would say other aspects are the hiding the complexities behind all the different EMRs that are out there, and being able to normalize that somewhat, as far as a payer being able to request directly of eHealth Exchange, then they manage the complexities, including geographical span or searches for patients, that kind of stuff. So it's making application functionality available to the requester without having to write it themselves, and really being able to share the assets. If that makes sense.
Well, say more about that. The requester being somebody from outside the health system.
Yeah, so say for example, a payer trying to gather quality measure data from EHRs out there, and they've maybe received a notice that a out-of-area provider has seen one of their patients that they want to try to gather that clinical evidence for, and without having to make a point-to-point connection with that EMR, or having to understand.
Sure. If you put without having to make a point-to-point connection in the problem statement, then yes, that's a differentiator. But I don't think that is the inherent pro of the networked FHIR. You've already accounted for that in the cons list of brokered FHIR. In terms of the data you can get or the jobs you can do with the data, I think they wind up being quite equivalent.
Yes, I would say the concept of a network enables some human elements to be streamlined or improved. And that's something that other companies or other services could provide, certainly. But when you have a network that's controlling some connectivity and sort of managing connectivity for you, it allows you to focus more on the data rather than on other componentry. As you know, to Dave's point, like if there are operational processes that you need to take on at the provider side, you don't actually have to own that implementation anymore. Those kinds of things I think are important. Contractually minimizing burden on all parties is another big one. And of course, TEFCA is doing the same thing in that regard.
Yeah, so I totally agree with those problem statements. I guess the way I would characterize those are benefits, let's say on the health system side, of having some kind of adapter tool that lets you connect to everyone else, whether that adapter is the network or whether that adapter just connects to the network in a standard way. That's the only detail I'm quibbling with.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and I think we do agree that there's always the opportunity for whether that's an API gateway or somebody to sell services into any node in the network rather than be part of the intermediary itself. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to briefly discuss what's out of scope for the discussion, member attribution between providers, payers, and generally understanding is a patient in a given provider system or payer system is not in scope for what we're talking about here. That determination is important to a lot of different traffic, and but it's not something that we really need to talk about when we're talking about connectivity directly.
That's interesting. So I might have said this is maybe one of the things where a network is best positioned to help, because this feels like a really big real world problem. At least the way I look at it in the TEFCA model today, anybody can query for data about anyone, and if they fill in the right purpose of use, then in theory they're going to see automated responses in pretty short order, and that's sort of allowed. But in most real world data exchanges, particularly around populations at risk, just because I'm allowed to share information with you doesn't mean I necessarily am going to yet. I might also want to make sure that we agree on some attribution characteristics, make sure this is our shared patient in some way, before I'm willing to sort of open that spigot. And the way that I've read the TEFCA documents, I could be wrong here, TEFCA hasn't really dealt with that. They've just said, authorized users can request data. And if you see a request coming from a TEFCA participant, it's valid because it's a TEFCA participant. Of course, they're sending you a valid request.
Right, because they are bound to contractually, but
right.
You might, like, I mean, I'm sure there is fraud in the network, and there's no real way to actually detect that or limit it using current state if there's no way to attribute patients and understand what's going on.
Yeah, so I could imagine that this sort of additional level of assurance to say, yeah, we're allowed to send you data, but also we agree on this roster, having both of those checks in place might help reduce unexpected or fraudulent data queries.
I agree. I think to your earlier point, though, that is not a function of networked FHIR specifically versus the brokered FHIR conversation. That is a function of the network and the overarching bodies that want to go do this kind of work. And I do see those as, like, even in the TEFCA world, the QHINs are sort of that same entity that are supposed to be coordinating and making life easier for participants to a degree. And I see that as their role as, bullet point 1 and 2 on this slide. But it's not specifically relevant to how FHIR traffic flows. I guess, you could make the statement that, okay, attribution has to occur before FHIR traffic can flow, so it is a gateway, but that could be on using any service. It doesn't have to be part of the network.
Yeah, all right. I think this is fair. I do see, maybe a little bit of a disconnect in the thinking in the TEFCA community between how many checks are you going to have in place for query-based exchange, and who's responsible for those, and how many checks are you going to have in place for the facilitated FHIR data access and who's responsible there. So in particular, I think for query-based exchange, there's really not a slot in the sort of authorization protocol for agreeing on an attribution list.
Right.
You see the query, you respond to the query. And then there's nothing different that's written in the facilitated FHIR context. It's just you make a connection and then query for what you're allowed to query for. So if you just sort of read that documentation, you might think, great, it's going to work the same way in FHIR that it's working in query-based exchange. But then you talk to health systems and they're not necessarily turning on their FHIR APIs for any external party to connect to, just on the basis of its own assertions.
Correct. Yeah, and rosters are a big deal right now in healthcare from a payer perspective to say these are the patients that we will send you data for. But there's no corollary in TEFCA, of course, for roster management. There is a Da Vinci concept that could hold some water in that regard, but I think that's actually getting to the overall point. And the overall point here is until we go practice this and figure out our muscle memory around how this is going to work and how our provider is actually going to respond, we don't know anything. We are sort of assuming that the treatment purpose of use is how everybody's going to start responding to healthcare operations. And, we can design different, SOPs around that, of course, but what is the CISO going to say when we say, hey, can you open up this, these FHIR APIs for this purpose? And we need to start going and figuring that out. We need to go figure out, okay, well, if you're going to say no, what if we did this beforehand? And so the eHealth Exchange is actually piloting a couple of different options where we have one organization that's already receiving ADTs from a health system. And they're going to say, okay, here's an ADT that you sent me. I'm now able to go get FHIR data because of that ADT. And so we have this chain that we can use to say, here's attribution. And the same concept we're going to look to deploy in Utah is to say the HIE in Utah has everybody's roster. And so the HIE is actually going to be able to determine who can go get data at a given point on, maybe that's through like a member dash match operation, or maybe it's through a different method, but you still have a single data repository that you can query to say, can I go get this information? And then you have a chain of trust between that and the responder.
Cool. Yeah, no, the idea that we don't know much until we try this stuff out, and the idea that we can use existing exchange protocols to create that chain of trust, those things all make a ton of sense to me. I do want to know, what does that CISO say in response to the parallel question? Well, you've got a treatment request coming in as a TEFCA query. Are you just going to respond to that? Like if they give a different answer for the queries coming in through FHIR or the queries coming in through IHE, patient lookup or document retrieve. If those answers are different, if you want more assurances in one case than the other, or you want to put different hurdles in place, I think it would be important to understand why those answers are different.
Agreed. That hasn't been our experience to date, just by the way, but I think, and that's only with a few health systems so far. And what we're seeing is that folks are eager to move over to FHIR and to start using their FHIR APIs for this purpose. But there's always this concern of, well, what if a patient's a self-pay for that encounter? Should we be sending you that data? Or what if it's a behavioral health encounter? Those are some of the most basic concepts where it's like, we don't actually know what to do there.
Yeah, no, for better or for worse, these kinds of fine-grained authorization rules, and they vary state by state and with intersections of different data types. This is some of the drudgery of writing a proper EHR system. And in a lot of cases, they can get these decisions right, but it's all based on internal logic. So an outside party can't sort of push down those query predicates or filters.
Right.
It's like either the functionality to do the authorization lives in the EHR, or you come up with a poor approximation from the outside.
All right, just jumping forward here. So our planned approach and a little bit about why is to enable network FHIR in the short term. We want to go do this, and we just talked about it. Like, let's go do it in production. Let's see how CISOs are responding. Let's see what the challenges are outside of basically solving for general FHIR traffic. We've solved for general FHIR traffic. We know how to do that in a network. And now, like, what are the operational considerations and constraints around this that are going to rear their heads to everybody in the near future as we start doing this at scale via UDAP or networked FHIR? So we started building out this peer group as well. Dave's a huge help in the creation of that peer group and getting payers and providers to really collaborate and work together towards solutions. The other thing that we're talking about is transitioning to brokered FHIR, facilitated FHIR when it's feasible, right? So when, the concept that we're looking at is when a responder becomes it sets themselves up as available for UDAP auto client registration, then we can allow for auto client registration. And so what we would see is within the eHealth exchange, we'll have traffic that's governed by our current agreement, the DURSA, and then we'll have traffic that's actually under TEFCA and using UDAP. The problem that I'm bringing up there is that there's two contracts. There's two different modes of operation, and that's only because TEFCA today is saying you have to use UDAP. If TEFCA didn't say you have to use UDAP, we could do networked FHIR under TEFCA. Everybody can be under the same contractual umbrella, and we can transition people into UDAP when it becomes available, because nobody here is saying that networked FHIR is faster or better in really any sense. We're just saying it's possible. And so that's what we're trying to do and what we're planning to do, but we're also lobbying for TEFCA changes so that we can see FHIR traffic under TEFCA instead of under the existing agreement.
So I want to make sure I understand the point about, you said there's two contracts. Who's signing two contracts?
So the eHealth exchange today has the DURSA, which allows organizations in the eHealth exchange sign the DURSA with each other, essentially, and it governs their how they're going to trade information. That includes FHIR data as well as CDA traffic. So in our current model with networked FHIR, organizations are required to sign the DURSA in order to join and to participate in the network. And then we'll also have, at some point, UDAP-based traffic. And that UDAP-based traffic, we ostensibly would want to put under the TEFCA contract, the common agreement, right? Because that umbrella is going to be the long-term one.
So, well, okay, a couple questions. Right now, under the current networking implementation with eHealth Exchange, it sounds like a healthcare provider who is part of a different QHIN wouldn't have a way to write these FHIR API calls into the eHealth Exchange network unless they also signed an agreement with eHealth Exchange. Is that right?
We do work with other networks, so Carry Quality. We would be willing to work with organizations on that network. Any network is able to communicate with us, but we don't see any of the other networks really adopting the networked FHIR approach. And so if you are a member of a different network, you don't necessarily have the tool set available to you to actually do this work.
Well, so I mean, let's just take something analogous to your FDA example. Let's just say like my local healthcare provider here in Madison, Wisconsin, had some quality improvement initiative. They want to see if they can do a better job taking care of patients with high blood pressure. And so they want to be able to do FHIR queries into this eHealth exchange network. Let's say they are already participating through a different QHIN that gets them some stuff. But they want to be able to do a FHIR query to a health system that already is part of eHealth Exchange. To make that work, does their QHIN need to sign an agreement with eHealth Exchange, or just the local hospital would need to sign an agreement with eHealth Exchange to be able to send over those queries?
So to make that work, the local hospital could join the eHealth Exchange directly, and of course then they're part of the network. The problem right now is that the other QHINs that if that QHIN, if that organization's part of another QHIN, like if that QHIN's supporting the facilitated FHIR approach, there's no real way to land that request. We don't have a way to actually facilitate that approach, either inside of our network as well as between networks. And so there is no TEFCA equivalent of FHIR traffic today, right? And so we would absolutely be willing to allow other networks to communicate with us on the networked basis and do multiple FHIR hops and to get to their point, right? But
so when you talk about a QHIN supporting facilitated FHIR, is that just the QHIN gives certificates to anybody who wants one, and then those participants can take their certificate and go talk to an endpoint? Or what more does the QHIN have to do to support facilitated FHIR?
the QHIN doesn't necessarily have to do much. I mean, we need the national directory in place, and the directory needs to have FHIR endpoints in it for sure. So we're not quite there. But what we also would need is the UDAP auto client registration in order for any of this traffic to be functional under TEFCA.
But that's not QHIN functionality. That's end node functionality.
That is true. Correct. Yeah.
And so I think, tell me if the summary is wrong. Right now, if somebody wants to be able to use the eHealth Exchange FHIR network capabilities, they pretty much need to sign an agreement, maybe the DRSA with eHealth Exchange to get on board.
Correct.
Okay, and the desired end state would be anyone who's a TEFCA participant should be able to do that just on the basis of being a TEFCA participant.
Correct, but TEFCA does not allow for that.
Because TEFCA, I'm trying to figure out where TEFCA doesn't allow for that. It's just that TEFCA only covers the specific capabilities that are enumerated in TEFCA, and if you support a new API endpoint or a new parameter, you have to go negotiate all your own agreements.
Yeah. I mean, the TEFCA FHIR SOP, I guess, does not include any concept of networked FHIR, right? It only, right, you must use UDAP.
By not mentioning something, like, I guess what I'm trying to understand is, if you go above and beyond the minimum requirements that are set out in the SOP, why would that prevent other TEFCA participants from using what you've built?
Well, we're not meeting the requirements because of the auto client registration. It's a must.
But it's not for you to meet them. That'd be something that your sites could do or not do. But then additionally, like for example, maybe your sites do that and you just use it, or maybe your sites do that, but you also still want to offer this network because it's a value add, or maybe your sites don't do it yet. None of those seem to have an implication for the QHIN. Those are all site responsibilities.
Yes, but the QHINs aren't supporting networked approach right now, right? And I guess they could, but it's not under TEFCA. Like if it's
not, I'm trying to understand, if eHealth Exchange is a TEFCA QHIN, and also has, in addition to meeting the minimum requirements, which let's just say you already meet them, and you offer additional APIs, are you not allowed to make those available to the other QHINs to call?
I don't think that TEFCA traffic allows for infinite traffic patterns. I think TEFCA traffic is specific to the traffic that's defined in the SOPs. So I don't think that you can leverage the common agreement for traffic that's not specified.
Ah, okay. The common agreement isn't just about use cases and purposes and obligations to respond. It's about responding only through a specific channel and no others.
Part of any network is to establish standards and protocols that you follow in order to communicate. And
The minimum basis makes sense to me.
Yeah. But we're not
I
meeting
don't know why you would
again,
meet them.
right?
But I think you are meeting them. The minimum basis for the QTF, at least the draft QTF2, the requirements for the QHIN are basically nothing. Being able to, I mean, the FHIR specific requirements for the QHIN, I'm struggling to think of what they even are.
Well, the participants wouldn't be meeting it, right?
Look, yeah, that's not an eHealth exchange question. That's about your participants. They don't need to meet it because it's optional.
Correct, but the traffic needs to be governed by an agreement, and the traffic itself is. So, are you thinking that the traffic is governed because it's QHIN traffic, and we're saying, okay, well, we're using the common agreement for this traffic, even though it doesn't meet any of the SOPs? Because that would be amazing if that's.
I wouldn't say it that way. I would say you meet all the SOPs and additionally offer, value-added capabilities that I would assume TEFCA participants could use.
I think I can poke around into that more as like an approach. I think ultimately, though, in order to make QHIN to QHIN, we would need QHIN to QHIN FHIR traffic to work, and we would need any participant to sign on to the networked approach in order to make that work. And without SOPs guiding that, then what we're saying is, hey, you can do this new service, and it's cool. It's under TEFCA, great. So you don't need a new agreement. But I also don't know that because they define purposes of use that are very specific to things that, well, maybe we could use the purposes of use too, because I don't know that they actually specify that auto client registration is required for them.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to go so deep on this, but it is sort of interesting to me, like what would need to change about TEFCA to make your approach sort of obviously fit. Because when I do read the draft QTF, there's not much that QHINs need to do, but then there's a ton of details about like the authorization payloads and extensions and all this stuff that I don't think has ever been tested. And it kind of scares me a little bit that would roll out as the official QTF technical framework for FHIR when it hasn't been shown to work.
Yes, I agree. And, I think that's where we are right now in our thinking as well, is to say, like, how is this going to happen in anywhere near the near term if EHRs aren't doing it today? Some EHRs are even saying they can't do it in the way it's specified today. And so that's why this, additional networked approach makes sense to us to say, okay, well, let's get 2 years of FHIR traffic under our belts while everybody else gets ready. To be able to do that under TEFCA would be a much better approach, though, because it's just more aligned with the future. So it's a good point.
Does the TEFCA directory allow a provider to have more than one FHIR endpoint in it?
The QTF2 that just got released allows a provider to join multiple QHINs, which means multiple directory entries. You may only have one directory entry per QHIN, and you may only have one FHIR endpoint per QHIN.
Okay, so that's maybe a sticking point. I'm just thinking about like if eHealth Exchange wanted to actually kick the tires on all this UDAP dynamic registration and the extensions and the authorization request and just try to sort of use those as at your own proxied endpoints, would you be able to list your own proxied endpoints as the FHIR endpoint for those participants? And I was thinking it would be more straightforward if they were allowed to have more than one. It's harder if they only get one.
Yeah, it wouldn't be possible to based on my understanding of the directory specification right now. then again, I mean, all we would be doing is networking FHIR and using an auto client registration to test out that componentry. And so I don't see how that's different from like a connectathon based approach.
One would allow any TEFCA participant to connect automatically. So that would be actually kicking the tires in production on this registration process.
The
Like you'd be
connection,
using the registration information.
they would have the same automated connectability as they would under networked. We would just be like running we'd be running the UDAP auto client registration a heck of a lot to allow for all the connections that happen for sure.
Yeah, like, and if that doesn't work, if it's not a good technology, then you'd be able to share that feedback and say, here's the problems with it. Because I worry that otherwise, things tick along and there's who else is generating feedback on this stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just think that it's business. It's basically just overhead, right? It's overhead for the sake of doing the thing. And
yeah. I guess if I could wave the magic wand, I would get rid of the dynamic registration and I would just have a list of clients published somewhere that all the QHINs could just.
The problem is you need a secret to maintain a secret.
I mean, you can use an asymmetric secret, right? So the published registration endpoint just lists either the public keys or the public key set URLs for those clients.
But the private key,
like that's done for smart health cards, for example, is we have a list of all the participants, health systems and pharmacies who can issue these verifiable credentials, and they keep their keys, and we just publish, the public part of the key pair.
I see. I think the issue is that you can only associate one public key with a given client ID, whereas in the EHRs today. So that's one of the constraints that we have.
Today they support a key set. That's important for being able to rotate your keys.
The rotation, so I mean, just the UI that we have available to us doesn't allow us to upload multiple public keys. We could support a key set.
So they have to be able to manage a key set with more than one key. That's just from the meeting the smart backend services registration requirements. But actually, what I was saying is not specifically about what the EHRs have built. I'm thinking about what a national registry of apps would want to host, or a national registry of clients would want to host. Otherwise, every QHIN or every EHR is building out their own version of this registration thing and keeping it running.
Yeah. So the thing is that EHRs need to. Ultimately, that's required essentially, because otherwise your traffic is always going to look as though it's coming from the intermediary, which is a negative for the networked approach, right? Because that single client ID really shouldn't be. It should be a client ID per requester.
So I mean, I totally agree with the point that it's important to have audit capabilities that understand the real source of the traffic, no question. But that can be worked out with the protocol that happens between the proxy and the backend. Like, this is a very common problem for reverse proxies on the web. You've got a reverse proxy sitting in front of all your traffic, but it's providing the backend the visibility that it needs to be able to appropriately maintain audit logs. How that happens is an internal detail. Maybe there's extra headers that are being conveyed, or maybe there's a logging API or whatever. It's important, but I think that's a solvable problem that you don't even necessarily need to standardize.
It is a solvable problem. It would require EHRs to take on some of the development burden and be able to ingest those headers or whatever else, right?
Yes.
I don't know what. Yeah, I mean, from the EHR or the client, the server standpoint, what's the burden look like compared? Do you want to own the client registration yourself, or would you rather let somebody else own that, and then you own the auditing processes that they provide to you? I don't know what the breakdown of that would look like. I think ultimately we're going to see EHRs adopt.
Yeah. So for me, the registration step itself is not so bad. What I worry about is who locks down the client metadata, and is that being done consistently? So like if I have a key pair, a certificate as a QHIN participant, and I want to go register an app that's like Josh's app, like that's cool. If I want to go register an app that's called Apple Health, that's not as cool. And I want to make sure that the endpoints that are accepting these dynamic registration requests aren't letting me go register an app called Apple Health. So there's some additional details. You could lock those down in a software statement, which I think that's how UDAP tends to do it. But in that case, everybody who issues those certificates also needs to be able to issue these software statements with correctly locked down registration metadata.
Yeah. Absolutely a challenge. I think the certificate gives us at least a signature on that so that we know who to track it back to, right?
Yeah. When the answer is, oh yeah, it got stolen and abused,
Yeah.
that tracking only helps you so much.
Yeah. Okay, we only got a few minutes here, Josh. So I think like we've talked through kind of the concepts, right? It does sound like we understand, we both kind of see the same details and the same issues, I would say. Are there things that you think we can do differently or should be talking about differently to move forward? That you haven't already put up, because I'm taking notes too.
No,
Yeah.
I think in general, operating in a way that lets you test out the long-term direction, like, especially if you're skeptical of the long-term direction, like taking actions now that will front load the risk, the things that you're skeptical about, would really help. And I think eHealth Exchange is probably better positioned than anyone to discover and publish those problems early. I've seen a lot of what I would label as magical thinking about, how just participating in TEFCA is going to solve some of these exchange problems. And the truth is, there's 4 or 5 other things that you need to work through. So the more that can happen early, the better. And the more that can happen publicly, the better.
Yep. Yeah, and one of those things that we are trying to do is really get the FHIR traffic up and running, right? And those conversations with CISOs, et cetera. I hear you on the UDAP concept and testing that out. And, I think that that's something we can explore further. The other thing that we're talking about more is the rosters and attribution and how does that all work in the real world? How do we deploy that? And we've put a lot of hours into that one as well. So moving things along, and hopefully we'll see more progress in the next 6-9 months around actual production implementations, and we'll be able to talk about how those worked, what worked well and what didn't.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'd love to follow up there, particularly around how rosters are being operationalized up there.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. I mean, we will be talking more about that and probably put something into place in the next 4 months, I would think. So we'll be we'll definitely reach out more about the roster concept and how management might work at a state level, I think is where we're going to start, because it's really the scaling of rosters that we see as a challenge.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
All right. I'm going to hit stop on the recording. Thank you so much for the discussion today.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate your time. I think, in the interim, if you see things happening or, want to reach out and talk about any topics that you're seeing on your side, we just appreciate like your guidance and leadership in this area. And I also just wanted to make you aware of everything going on in case something does come up that we can be a part of or help out with.
Get some questions around the bulk FHIR too. Those are still outstanding, Scott?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. From the bulk FHIR perspective, are you seeing adoption at scale with like large volumes of patients? Our understanding is that it's just not functioning at scale.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good assessment in terms of the certified EHR capabilities.
Yeah.
I think what we've seen is a set of certification rules that the EHRs are meeting in ways that don't actually solve the real world access needs. So we've been thinking a lot about what would be the steps that ONC could take to ensure that an EHR that supports bulk is actually supporting export across the large populations that their customers might want to access. This is a real gap. So we shared feedback on HTI-1 with some ideas about how to achieve this. Hoping maybe we'll see more in HTI-2 about this. fundamentally, I guess I would say on bulk, there's a lot of use cases that would be unlocked with the kind of data warehouse technology that EHRs already have. But the EHRs have implemented bulk support on top of their operational data structures, generally speaking. And so there's this divide where, when a health system says, we want to do this analysis across thousands of patients, can we do it with FHIR bulk? The EHR vendor will say, oh no, but you can use our own data warehouse that doesn't do FHIR, but it'll be much better for your use case. So we haven't been able to connect the dots on these standards. One thing I would really like to see is an ONC requirement for doing bulk export across your whole population, and have some performance targets for this. They might have to be relative performance targets, but if you're an EHR and you've got an existing data warehousing capability, your bulk FHIR should maybe be within a certain fraction of the speed of that. It shouldn't be 10 million times slower.
Yeah.
So those are some of the discussions, but I totally would validate the issues we've been running into with making bulk work. Two quick things here. One is a recent publication just sort of characterizing some of those challenges. That's from Boston Children's Hospital, just trying to use this in the real world. And the other one is just the data point that non-EHR entities who have wanted to make bulk work for participation in research networks, these kinds of use cases, they've been able to do it. HIEs, for example, setting up their own infrastructure. It's not that the API surface area is so challenging that it can't be implemented in a performant way. It's just you have to take that performance into account when you're coming up with your implementation plan.
Sure.
Right. On top of your operational stack, yep.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. Is there a requirement in FHIR that the data is real time?
So I think the right place to look for a requirement would be on the ONC front. And when ONC requires the use of FHIR APIs, I don't know that they have language that says, this sort of real-time flavor to it. It's almost one of these areas where you don't think to write that rule until somebody breaks the implicit model that you had in mind.
Yeah, we almost need to make bulk a not real-time standard.
No, I think that's exactly right. At least clarify that's an acceptable way to implement it.
Yeah,
right. That way you know it's in the warehouse instead of the operational side.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, if on the other hand somebody tried to use their patient access API to connect, Common Health on their Android phone to their clinical data, and what they got was from 3 quarters ago, because the health system has a policy of updating that thing, once a year, like that seems obviously wrong. And so being able to spell out why one is right and the other one is wrong is a little bit subtle, but I think it's doable.
I agree.
The difference between a list and an individual, really.
Yep. You could just make a carve out specifically for the population level APIs.
Appreciate your time, Josh.
Very much. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. It's good to chat. Take care,
Thanks,
guys.
See ya.
Take care. Bye.